guys, welcome to the last video in the functions playlist. We're going to be talking about inverse functions here. And what do we mean by the word inverse? Well, it basically just means doing the opposite. So I'm trying to give you a real life example here. It's not the best example if I'm honest, but think about when you get up in the morning, you get out of bed, then you go and have your breakfast, then you jump in the shower before you leave for school or work or whatever. So when we're doing the opposite, think of that in reverse. You've got to go through all of these activities backwards. So you've got to get unwashed, and then you've got to not have your breakfast. So the breakfast might be coming out the other way perhaps, and then jumping back into bed. That's kind of like what we mean by the inverse, just to give you some idea to hold on to. Mathematically, it's a lot easier to demonstrate. So if we had a function that was to add 4 to all of our inputs, then the inverse function of that would be to take away 4, and it would get us back to the original results. If we had a function that was to subtract 6 each time from our inputs, then obviously the inverse function would be to add 6 each time. Multiplying and dividing are also the inverse of each other, so timesing by 10 can be undone by dividing by 10, and that would be the inverse. The notation, f of x is a function notation. If you want inverse function notation, it's f to the minus 1. So that's you might see that possibly in your textbooks or in your test as to represent the inverse function. So let's have a go at a proper example, a proper question. Here are 3 easy steps, all right, to change a function. So here's our function. Our f of x is 2x plus 3. That's our function there. Times by 2 and add 3. That's our function. So how do we undo that process, okay, to get the opposite? So I've got the answer here. This is the answer. So let's see how we get from the function to the inverse function. So the first thing I've done in my 3 easy steps is to swap out f of x for y. We're used to dealing with equations that look like this at GCSE. So let's start by just replacing the f of x for a y, and then we can start on the second part. So rearrange the equation to make x the subject of the formula. Now if you don't know what the subject means, y is currently the subject of the formula because it's on its own. It's telling us how to work out y. So y is the subject. If we wanted to make x the subject of the formula, then we'd have to get x on its own. So we'd have to get rid of this plus 3 and this times by 2. So we'd have x equals something. So let's start doing that. Let's get rid of the plus 3 first. Now, there's 2 ways to think about it. You can subtract 3 from both sides, or you can pick up the plus 3 and move it to the other side, where it will do the opposite. It does the inverse, so it will become a minus 3. And it will look like this once you've moved it over. Let me try and line up the equal signs. Always good to have those lined up for your working. So the plus 3 has moved to the other side to become a minus 3. The next step is to get rid of the times by 2. So it's timesing by 2, and if I want to move it to the other side, it will do the inverse. It will divide the other side by 2. So it will look like this once we've rearranged it. So here we don't have any divide signs in algebra, so we use a fraction line to represent our division. So we've got y minus 3 all being divided by 2, and now x is the subject of the formula. So we've finished step 2. Step 3 just says swap x and y over. So swap any x's that you have for y's, and it will look like this. So we'll swap the x's and the y's over, and now we have our answer. Alright, so this is our inverse function. This function here does the opposite to the original function, does the inverse. So we can simply write this part here as our answer. We might want to swap back the notation, so change the y to the inverse function notation, f to the minus 1. And that now says the inverse function is x minus 3 all divided by 2. Okay, so here's a practice question for you to have a go at. Pause the video, have a go at doing the 3 steps, and I will go through the solution in a couple of seconds. Okay, hopefully you've had a go at that. Let's have a look at the solution. I'll put the working up and we'll talk through it. So hopefully you replaced your f of x for a y to make it easier to work with. The minus 7 moves over to the opposite side in the first step to become a plus 7. Then we need to divide by 3 to get rid of the 3. So we divide all of the left-hand side here by 3, and that brings us down to this line. And then the final stage, since we've made x the subject, we just need to swap our x's and our y's over. and then we are left with the answer. So this part here is now the inverse function to the original, and I'd encourage you to write it like this. Swap the y out for the inverse function notation, and it will look like this. The final answer looks like that. I hope that's been helpful to give you an idea of what an inverse function is. Obviously, go away and look up some extra practice questions if you need to. I'd recommend that you do as much practice as you can with this, because if it's new to the GCSE, I hope this whole playlist has been helpful just to give you an idea of what might be coming up on the new GCSE.